Hey, as I said, it's a difficult chapter this week. Uh, as I started reading, praying through this text and reading through commentaries as I was working on it this week, I came across one commentator who summed up the whole passage with this little sentence: "This narrative will surely not be widely used in theological exposition." Oh, great. It will surely not be one of those that you turn to over and over again. It's going to be sparse. I found very few people willing to preach on this text this week. But again, as I've said here many times before, and it bears repeating, part of the philosophy of ministry here is that I don't want to be the person dictating what gets spoken. I know how foolish and flawed I am. I pick books of the Bible and we preach through them, and when it comes to difficult things or things that, other people would be like, I don't know, I really want to do a sermon on that. Even in those moments, we say, this is the Word of God. It is valuable, it is helpful for us, and it may not be as straightforward as some other places, but we're not going to shy away from that. So, if you have a Bible, you can turn to a rarely preached on Genesis chapter 34. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one in the chairs in front of you. If you're using one of those, we're on page 28 and 29 this morning. We have the whole chapter of Genesis chapter 34. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. His soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman, and he spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl for my wife." Now Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with his livestock in the field, so Jacob held his peace until they came. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. The sons of Jacob had come in from the field as soon as they heard of it, and the men were indignant and very angry, because he had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing must not be done. Hamor spoke with them, saying, "The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him to be his wife. Make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You shall dwell with us, and the land shall be open to you. Dwell and trade in it, and get property in it." Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me, I will give. Ask me for as great a bride price and gift as you will, and I will give whatever you say to me. Only give me this young woman to be my wife." Sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully, because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to them, "We cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we agree with you, that you will become as we are, by every male among you being circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to ourselves, and we will dwell with you and become one people. But if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter, and we will be gone." Their words pleased Hamor and Hamor's son Shechem, and the young man did not delay to do the thing, because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. Now he was the most honored of all his father's house. So Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of the city and spoke to the men of the city, saying, "These men are at peace with us. Let them dwell in the land and trade in it, for behold, the land is large enough for them. Let's take their daughters as wives, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men agree to dwell with us to become one people, when every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised. Will not their livestock, their property, and all their beasts be ours? Only let us agree with them, and they will dwell with us." And all who went out of the gate of the city listened to Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of his city. On the third day, when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city. And while it felt secure, and killed all the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem, with the sword, and they took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, and whatever was in the city and in the field, all their wealth, all their little ones and their wives, all that was in the houses, they captured and plundered. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You've brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, the Perizzites. My numbers are few. If they gather against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." But they said, "Should he treat our sister like a prostitute?" Word of the Lord. Let's pray. Lord, I ask for your guidance this morning in a particularly difficult passage of Scripture. We ask that you would be more clearly understood and revealed as a result of the exposition here. That our belief that you have poured out this word intentionally would be rewarded this morning, Lord, and that you would be brought to the forefront of our minds and our lives. As we find the failed moral example of Jacob, his daughters, and his sons, we ask that you would lead us away from this type of behavior, to be set apart for you. I pray these things, Lord, in your Son's name. Amen. Nice and ugly story, isn't it? You cringe a little bit, almost just reading it. It's not a bedtime Bible story. You know, I've got two little kids. None of the children's Bibles included this one somehow. I don't know how they missed that. The question is almost immediately there that you can't get away from. Why is this even included? Why would this be thrown into the narrative? There were obviously things that happened that weren't recorded in the biblical text. So why is this one? Why do they think we really need to capture that story down for future generations? I'm trying to answer that just right here at the beginning to help guide our thinking through this morning. At a narrative level, chapter 34 serves to show us that Israel is becoming like the Canaanites. They're merging into one thing. They're almost indistinguishable in this text, right? They're all just kind of trying to pull one over on the other, and everybody is sinful. There's not a single person in the story that is without at least a little bit of conviction is probably the wrong word, a little bit of shade thrown at them from the narrator, to use more modern lingo. The covenant family is becoming like the Canaanites, like the people in the land. And this story is here to remind us that the purpose of Egypt is not an accident. That when God removes the family from Canaan to take them down to Egypt, that is a purposeful maneuver for the health of the covenant family. If they are to stay in the land, they're going to become like the people of the land. The Canaanites are inclusivists. Let's all just, you give us your daughters, we'll marry yours, and we'll just all become one people. You heard it said multiple times in that story. The Egyptians were purists. Hey, we're fine if you Hebrews live here, but you got to live over there, and you stay with your people, and that's fine. But you're not Egyptians, and let's make that clear. So this, at a big picture story level, helps to clarify why God is going to take his people to Egypt. It is necessary for the building of the family and the nation. There's a secondary reason that I think is illuminated more next week, so I will save it for then. I'll point back to this chapter. I think one of the sad things about people skipping over chapter 34 so routinely is that they miss some of the importance of chapter 35. A lot of commentators try to just segment it off as this one-off story that doesn't relate to anything. I think they miss a pretty significant point there, but we'll get to that next week. So, the covenant family is becoming like the Canaanites, and this is illustrated by this broken story. Same thing's going to happen in chapter 38. If you know your timeline of Genesis, at least in not necessarily chronological order, but in recorded order. Chapter 37, you have Joseph in the amazing colored coat, and he's sold to Egypt. And chapter 39, you have Joseph in Potiphar's house, and it's like they should have gone together, but right in the middle of it, there's this story about Judah and Tamar and all of this brokenness there. It's the same purpose, and we'll get to that when we get to chapter 38. It's to remind us the reason God is not mystified by Joseph going down to Egypt. This is purposeful. Don't forget that God's sovereign hand guides this. So that's what's happening here. But let's look at the story. It's ugly, and it even deserves our attention in its ugliness. We start really, the chapter marker's probably in the wrong place. The previous 3 verses of chapter 33 should be included. In Jacob, verse 18 of chapter 33, Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem in the land of Canaan on his way from Paddan Aram, and he camped in the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought 100 pieces of money, a piece of land on which he pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it Elohe Israel. So that's really the start of this story. Well, it's not necessarily hidden from view, but right there, we don't know our ancient Near East geography in the way that the recipients of this letter would have. Jacob falls short of full obedience. Chapter 31, he's called to return back to the land from which he came. There aren't really clear borders of Israel at this point. There's a vague outline of what God has promised to give to this family, but it's not clearly defined. So when God tells Jacob to go back to where he came from, that has to be thought of as Bethel. This is where God spoke to him the last time, where the heavens opened up and the stairway came between the two. Do you remember? He laid his head on a rock, and in the night he had a dream, and God came from heaven to earth to speak to Jacob and tell him he would protect him and bring him back. Well, in chapter 31, he's told it's time to come back, and he comes 95% of the way, but he stops at Shechem. Shechem's probably a day's journey short of Bethel. Jacob stops because Bethel is in the middle of nowhere. You remember, the city is founded on Jacob putting his head on a rock in the desert. There's nothing else around. And it didn't seem advantageous for Jacob to go out into the middle of nothing. So he stops short at Shechem, which is a major city with a lot of trade possibilities. And he's there for years based on the ages of his children. I bring that up to say that this whole story should have been avoided. Jacob wasn't obedient in his call. I will bring you back, says God Almighty. And now in chapter 31, he tells him that the time has come to return back, and he stops short. It immediately calls to mind for me the story in 2 Samuel chapter 11, perhaps the most famous moral lapse in all of the Bible, of David and Bathsheba. That story begins by setting the stage, much in the same way you just saw with Jacob, that in the springtime, the armies of the ancient Near East the kings would send out their armies to go do battle. And David sent out his army, and yet he remained back in Jerusalem. That's the first verse of 2 Samuel 11, paraphrase. David's supposed to go out. He's supposed to be the king who leads his army into battle, and yet he stays back home. The moral failure with Bathsheba should never have happened because David wasn't doing what he should to begin with. The same thing happens here with Jacob. I don't want to overplay my hand, but it feels like there's a point of application here. Moral failings are frequently built on ourselves putting ourselves in the wrong place. When you rely just on willpower, right, you throw yourself in a compromised situation and then go, I'll just do the right thing. It'd probably be better not to get in the situation to begin with. That's what Jacob has done here, and then you're going to see his daughter Dinah follow suit. We begin with the daughter defiled in verses 1 through 4. So I mentioned at the beginning that everyone in this text is to blame. You may think, well, wait a minute, Dinah didn't do anything. Not quite, but the very first verse, I know she doesn't speak through the whole narrative, but the very first verse, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. It's a peculiar phrase. It's only used one other time in the whole book of Genesis. It's in chapter 27, verse 46, when Rebekah is speaking to her husband Isaac, trying to convince him not to allow their son Jacob to take a wife from the women of the land. This dubious group of people, they're just out there, those women. Those are the kids you don't want your children to be friends with, right? The women of the land, this corrupting people out there. And Dinah wants to go be with them. Jacob starts in the wrong place. Dinah follows suit. She should have never gone out. And her actions have terrible consequences. Now I know in the current moral landscape, what I've just done would be flirting with the edge of what is known as victim blaming. I don't care. I say that as gently as I possibly can. I'm not saying that Shechem is not responsible for his actions. He is. But Dinah places herself in a compromised situation. This wouldn't have been information that would have been lost on her. This would not have been a good era for young women just to go out by themselves. She made a poor decision, and she's responsible for her poor decision, not what other people have done with it. But that doesn't get her off the hook. She goes out when she shouldn't have, and the women of the land, whether she ever makes it to the social group that she's anticipating going towards or not, what results is disastrous. She is seen by a young prince in the land named Shechem. And you see these quick verbs in succession. He saw her, he seized her, he lay with her, and humiliated her. It escalates quickly. One poor decision about who to spend their time with, and all of a sudden, we are in a world of brokenness. Now, it feels like, and this is, you can disagree with me if you'd like, and I'll try and make my case as clearly as I can through the whole morning. But it feels like the narrator has included as many details and editorial remarks to make this as difficult of a moral situation to sort through as you possibly can. So Jacob shouldn't have been doing what he was doing, and Dinah should have been doing what she was doing, and that doesn't excuse anything, and then Shechem's behavior on top of this. But then, as wicked and dubious as Shechem is, he then seems to act at least semi-honorably. What is his response to this wicked thing that he does? By the custom of the day, he offers to take Dinah as his bride. Now, I try to put your cultural critic in the chair. Just let it sit right there. That sounds awful to you, I know. By the culture of the day, that was the honorable response to his wicked deed. It doesn't seem that way to us, and that's okay. Understand it. But based on the original author and hearers of this story, that would have been okay, he's trying to make right what he did wrong. And he offers, he wants to marry Dinah. He offers not just to allow her family to live in the land, which is a pretty big get for Jacob, right? This is the promised land. But on top of that, he offers to pay any bridal price. You name it. Verse 10 and verse 11, you see it there. You shall dwell in the land with us, and it shall be open to you. Dwell in it and get property in it. Verse 11, verse 12, ask for me as great of a bride price and gift as you will, and I will give you whatever you say to me. So yes, he's acted poorly, and yet he seems to be trying to make it right. Now, in the midst of this, you have a bunch of silence from Jacob. It's almost eerie how quiet he is. He doesn't speak up until the last 2 verses. I have a daughter. I cannot imagine silence as my response to this situation. Cannot imagine. Jacob says nothing. There's, again, this isn't explicitly from the text, and I didn't find any commentator suggesting this. This is just me. So you can feel free to know that I'm on as flimsy a ground as I possibly can, and that it is only my thoughts here. I think the text is nodding its head towards Jacob's favoritism for children from Rachel versus children from Leah. He says nothing because this is the unwanted daughter of an unwanted wife. Essentially, in honest but painful terms, he doesn't care. You can see that by the way the progress of the chapter describes Dinah. She goes from the parental relationship between her and her father. You see in verse 1, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob. Verse 5, Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah. Verse 19, and the young man did not delay to do the thing. Did I get the right verse? Oh yeah, because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. But as the narrative rolls on, she changes from her description from that of a parent-child relationship to that of a sibling relationship. She is more frequently described, and definitely towards the later end of the narrative, as the sister of Levi and Simeon. Verse 13, the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully because he had defiled their sister. Verse 14, they said to them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister. Verse 25, on the third day, Dinah's brothers. And verse 31, why should he treat our sister? She could have been described, why should they treat your daughter? But Jacob is silent. Jacob is silent, and the unwanted love for the unwanted wife and the unwanted children rings hollow. Not just hollow to Dinah, but to her also unwanted brothers. Simeon and Levi cannot stand this. From a very human perspective, you can feel their frustration, right? He's never cared about us. He doesn't care about our sister. If he's not going to do anything, then we will. This leads to the son's response. Levi and Simeon decide they can't stand for this. And they concoct a plan. And you're told right out of the gate, it's deceit. Verse 13, the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully. Whatever is about to come out of their mouths, it's not as straightforward as it may seem. They are ticked, not just at their father, but also at Shechem, who's defiled their sister and, as every indication would give, is still keeping her. You see in verse 17, then we will take our daughter and be gone. And after the slaying of the whole town, verse 27, the sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city. I missed it, one verse up. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house. They have every right to be angry. And in their anger, they come up with a plan. Shechem, you can marry our sister. Here's what you have to do. It is our way, our tribe's tradition that all the males need to be circumcised. And before you can marry into this family, you're going to have to follow through on that. Now, circumcision was obviously, you've seen in this narrative, a rite of Israel. You see in Genesis 17, it's given by God as a sign of the covenant. But it was also a mark that was used in the ancient Near East in anticipation of marriage for young men. And Simeon and Levi used this opportunity to their advantage. We are going to weaken this defiler. I'm going to show him what happens to him who does the wrong thing to our family. The line in the sand has been crossed, and hell hath no fury. It's coming for you. They speak kindly at first. You just fulfill this one obligation, and then we can become one people, right? The brothers start that language. Now it's deceitful, but it's still indicative. It shows you a little bit of where their mind is. And their deceit is met by Shechem and Hamor's deceit. It almost feels like they deserve each other, right? We've got this plan. But Shechem and Hamor, they're thinking their own plan. They go to the gates of the city. And they offered great things to the brothers. You can live in the land and possess it and marry our daughters, and we'll just become this one people. It'll be really nice. But then when they go to speak to their people at the city gates, which is a binding social contract. This was the notary republic of the day, all right? You came together and you put that stamp on there that said this happened and this is the way it is. And they change the language when they start speaking to their own countrymen. They don't mention that they offered the Israelites land. And the closing remark in verse 23, will not their livestock and property all be ours? Their intention is their own personal economic gain. All of a sudden, Shechem's goodwill seems to have disappeared. It's ugly. I was reminded as I was thinking of this, of the famous cartoon. You can click one for me, Liz. You remember this? Norman Rockwell, right? The Saturday Evening Post. And you've got a woman at the butcher, and she's weighing her meat that she's about to purchase. And they're both looking up at the scale, and the butcher subtly has his finger pushing down on his side of the scale, while the sweet old lady has her finger pushing up on the other side of the scale. They deserve each other right there. It's just deceit all the way around. That's what's happening in this story. Nobody's honest. It's two liars clothed in the mask of virtue. They're just full of it everywhere you turn. Well, it turns out that Simeon and Levi are the better deceivers. Verse 25, on the third day when they were sore, the two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males. I'm not a doctor. I don't think I need to elaborate on the point, but I'm guessing that an adult circumcision with rudimentary tools and no painkillers would not have been an enjoyable experience. This whole city is weakened. They're susceptible. Just where Simeon and Levi want them. And they put them to the sword. And they kill every last one of them. And what can only be described as a disproportional response. Yes, Shechem was wicked. Shouldn't have done what he did. neither should have Dinah nor Jacob, but Simeon and Levi just go, fine. You ever seen kids get into an argument? Somebody's got to be the first one to raise those stakes, right? You know what I'm talking about? The first kid to go from just a bump of a shoulder or a push to start swinging. All right, you want to do this? I'll be the one to come at you. That's what these two just did. I'm not going to wait for him to throw the first punch. We'll take him out before he can. And they put him to the sword. And the opposite of Shechem and Hamor's plans come to fruition. They have the plan to take all of the wealth of Israel, and what happens? All of the sons of Jacob plunder their city and take it all. The narrative closes with Jacob's rebuke. Once again, as I said, nobody is seen in a positive light in this story. Jacob, who shouldn't have been here in the first place, was silent on the defiling of his daughter, is now selfish in his rebuke of his sons. It's the first person pronouns all over this thing. Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You've brought trouble on me by making me stink. My numbers are few. If they gather against me and attack me, I will be destroyed." Come on. Do you care about anybody else here, Jacob? Oh yeah, both I and my house. To which Jacob's two sons respond, "Should he treat our sister like a prostitute?" And the rhetorical question ends the story. Real uplifting Sunday, right? What are you supposed to do with this? I struggled with it this week, I'm not going to lie. There's quite a few things that you can chase in this little narrative. There are a couple that I'll mention, but I think get more full treatment later on in the Genesis narrative, so we'll wait until then to really chase down those themes. One, Jacob's sons have learned the deceitful ways at the feet of their father. Once again, the sin of the parents has been passed on. And this is going to only escalate with the Joseph narrative. Also, and this again gets far more treatment in Joseph's story, God can use evil for his own purposes. Don't make him collude with it. I'm not saying God did these wicked things, but I'm saying that he uses brokenness to bring beauty. And again, that will be a primary theme in Joseph's story. So what do we have for us today? What can you walk away with from this ugliness? I don't know about you. Maybe this is just a personal contention. My big struggle in this story through the whole thing was what's the right answer? Where are the ethics here? What is anybody supposed to do? Because all of it's wrong, so what would be right? And perhaps to phrase it in another way, what would a faithful response from a follower of Christ look like in this situation? What would the God-honoring behavior be? Again, I've suggested that the ethical problem is intentionally made difficult by the narrator. You may have missed some of it. Let me go back and recap. I've already pointed out to you Jacob and Dinah being in the wrong places because of poor decisions. Shechem, you've already seen, he rapes Dinah, sees what he wants and takes, and then tries to kind of make restitution, but then in the restitution it's all kind of deceitful. And then every step of the way with the questionable morals of the brothers, the narrator reminds you, but it's because of the defiling of Dinah. You can see it, verse 13. They answered Shechem and his father deceitfully because he had defiled their sister Dinah. Verse 27, the sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. The narrator ties an immediate causal connection between the wickedness of Shechem and the wickedness done to Shechem and his friends and family. The ethical problem of the story is the same as the narrative problem of the story. Therefore, the ethical answer of the story is going to be the same as the narrative answer. What do I mean? What did I tell you was the narrative problem? Israel is becoming like the Canaanites. Their ethics are indistinguishable from those of the people of the land. It's just becoming this gray blur. There's no redemptive, set-apart people anymore. They're just all broken. If the narrative solution is Egypt that will eventually end in Exodus, the ethical solution has to be to remove yourself from this type of ethical behavior. I can reduce that to just about one word: holiness. Again, allow me to clarify. The story is full of ethical lapses. I could point to every character and try to illustrate this, but I think the clearest one is what happens with Simeon and Levi's treatment of circumcision. Circumcision is given in Genesis 17 as a sign of what? God's blessing and a reminder of the covenant. What is it done? How is it used in Genesis 34? They've taken what God gave them to bless and mark the covenant, and they've used it as a way to, with wickedness in their heart, get their own vengeance. The family has lost sight of the covenant and lost sight of God's redemptive work. Simeon and Levi value circumcision no higher than the Hivites in the land that they're living in. It's just a tool to be used. It's just a means to get to their end. God's provision that they should be reminded of in this sign is used for their own selfish purposes. It would be the equivalent of today inviting someone to church that you really don't like, asking them to partake in communion, encouraging them to be the first one to go, and poisoning the cup. That should be a little bit painful, right? When we come to the table of the Lord's Supper and are reminded of what Christ did for us, that great truth of God's life for ours, my sin to Christ, Christ's righteousness to me, and to take and pervert that, to use it to get back at somebody that I don't like. That's what they've done. They don't value the covenant. They don't value God's work in their lives. They've become just like the nations. Instead of focusing on extending the covenant and the faithful execution of God's blessing to Abraham, right? That's what you remember. Through you, Abraham, all the peoples of the world will be blessed. Instead of extending and bringing out that covenant in the way that they are told, Simeon and Levi exploit the covenant in literal execution of the nations that they are supposed to be blessing. Let me say it one more time. Instead of focusing on extending the covenant in a faithful execution of God's blessing to Abraham, Instead, they exploited the covenant in literal execution of the nations they were supposed to be blessing. The covenant family was brought about not because they were so special, but because through them God was going to bless the world. And yet here we have them using that covenant to kill the world. What was supposed to be an extension of God's blessing to the nations is instead an extension of curse, of hatred. The family has lost their ethical moorings. They are surrounded by the Canaanites, and they are becoming like them. At least in this narrative, in their reverence and their ethics. There's no difference. They've adopted the lifestyle of being Canaanites. 2 points of application here. Do I have time for either of them? 5 minutes. I can make that happen. First, never view God as a means to an end. If you think of God as a way to get to what you really want, perhaps to put it in far more personal terms, if you come to church so that you can find some selfish desire, then I suggest you drop to your knees and ask God to change your heart, to find in Him what you should be finding there and nowhere else. Never view God as a means to an end. Second, and this is really where the narrative meets the ethical and the applicational. Holiness matters. Holiness matters. To be set apart, sacred. The family has lost any notion of being set apart. They're just like the nations. If you want to put all of your empathic side on full bore and say, I get that, but they don't have all of Scripture guiding them. Okay, let me grant you that. Let me pin myself in a corner on my criticism of the ethics of the family. They don't have they don't even have the law, much less the person of Christ and the teachings of Paul or any of the rest of the biblical witness to who God is. They have very little. I think they have at least 2 points. And maybe even only one. I can really do it with just one. The first, that all people, all of humanity, is created in the image of God, Genesis 1:27. Now maybe they don't actually have that revelation. Maybe that's not been spoken clearly to them. We can at least, without a doubt, say that they definitely know that they are to be a blessing to the nations, Genesis 12:3. Through this family, the nations of the world will be blessed. If you just take those 2 ethical guide markers, this whole story is avoided. If they find holiness as just following those 2 things, all people are made in God's image, and our purpose and goal as God's covenant family is to bless the nations. If you just bring about those 2, that's all of the ethical guidance you need. If you are just set apart on those 2 areas. Instead, they've adopted the competing guideposts of the nations. Instead of humanity being made in God's image, humanity is only valuable if they are in my in-group. Right? That's what Shechem and Hamor do. We'll lie to whoever we need to help us and our families. And instead of you are to be a blessing to the nations, you do whatever you need to make yourself rich. What would change with just these 2 points? The whole story. Jacob, instead of finding blessing at the crossroads of trade and wealth, finds blessing at Bethel where he's supposed to be. Dinah, instead of trying to find fulfillment and blessing out with the women of the land, stays at home and knows that blessing is to be extended not by being with the people of the land, but by blessing them through what God has given. Simeon and Levi, who are without a doubt the more difficult side, it's very hard to bless the nations when they are at the point of your sword. The ethical mess of Genesis 34 is a result of disregarding holiness. I don't care. We're not set apart. They're just like everyone else. They've become like the world. And here, of course, if this is in the application section, we have a difficult question, do we not? Do we have the same problem? Have we become so like the world in our ethics, in our behavior, in our thinking that we're indistinguishable? We are all too familiar with having both feet in the world of the nations and a thin, socially maintainable patina of Jesus stuff to keep up our appearances. We have to ask ourselves, even just with these two ethical guideposts, is my view of blessing and of humanity so close to the world's that my behavior has become indistinguishable? I'll do what I need to do to whoever I need to do to get what I want. We always forget the second half of that famous verse, right? James chapter 1, verse 27, pure and faultless religion, to look after orphans and widows, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Holiness, being set apart, that's pure and faultless religion. Holiness matters. If holiness was a priority for any of the characters in this story, it would have resulted differently. Any of them. Even for Simeon and Levi, and like I said, this has got to be the most difficult one. How does a holy, faithful follower of Christ respond to violence done to your family? Well, we can all at least say, put them to death is not the response, right? Murder their whole family is wrong. They went too far here. So what is the proper response? How does holiness invade your perception so much that this isn't the result? I think it's fairly clear from the teachings of Christ, probably the most famous biblical passage on ethics. You are to turn the other cheek. Even in the midst of great oppression and violence. That's the example of Christ given for you. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The holiness of God invaded your life so much that you can even see your oppressor as one who's loved by God. The evil person doing the violence. That seems absurd to our world, does it not? The hashtag mob world. If I need to out somebody who's done wrong to me, I'm going to whip up a mob to tear them down, to skewer them. And I'm not at all for 1 second suggesting that this means we don't have a justice system or that evil should go unchecked. What I am suggesting is that as a faithful follower of Christ, your default mode as you walk in the steps of your Savior is to forgive even the worst of the oppressors. the vile people that no one likes. You want a truly revolutionary response. It's not to stir up an angry mob, but to appease, to try and talk down the anger of others as you defend the one who's injured you. Through tearful eyes, and I forgive. Christ forgave me. I forgive them. There's a great example of this that came to light in our world over 10 years ago now. October of 2006. It was a worldwide story. A gunman in Pennsylvania broke into a small schoolhouse, Amish kids, tied up 10 girls and shot them all before turning the gun on himself. 5 out of the 10 girls died. Within hours, the community had publicly forgiven the gunman. At his funeral a few days later, the majority of the people there were from the Amish community that he tried to wipe out. It later came to light that that same community set up a fund to help support his widow and 3 kids. It was fascinating. I was going back through this story this week and reading these secular reporters who couldn't quite understand this. They couldn't wrap their minds around it. Who does that? Who looks at the person who shot their daughter and says, I want to care for his family? That's the type of call you're looking at through holiness, to be set apart, to view yourself as a blessing to the nations. To look the worst of the worst oppressors in the face and say that even though you are violent to me, and whatever it may be, whether it's physical or social or sexual violence, whatever it may be, to give the faithful, holy, biblical response means that at the forefront of your mind is the truth that even that wicked oppressor is made in God's image. And even that wicked oppressor is the object of God's blessing. That is a high bar, church. Go clear it. Go live as Christ. Don't allow the slow creep of becoming like the world result in Genesis 34 in your life. Be holy, for he is holy.